course, it can improve it. We know we have UPE, but how many children are able to access UPE? It's very underfunded with 20,000 capitation as the capitation grant. So there's often no sitting space and very, really challenges poor quality of the public schools. And this is important because for children in particular, they really keep underscoring. When you're analyzing, when you're looking at the rubric, and if you look at that little handout, for children, and the full protocol is online, and in the book you will see we really get into it. But for children, they really underscore the importance of public education, and so investing in that. And when we get to, so you're a bit older now you're working, what is there for you? We used to have some things that we're trying to think around this, but again, not very much. If you're in the formal sector, maybe you're contributing social security like some of us are with NSSF, although again, we have while it technically falls under social security, and even so in our policy, as a social protection program, we have serious issues with it because again, it's a one-off payment, and most of us, we know the data shows most people have used it up very quickly, and then you're there in your old age. If you're lucky enough to work for government, you will get your pension. And if you're in the informal sector, then you're really falling through the cracks. Although there are some innovations around you trying to getting people to contribute through voluntary programs. And we used to have things like cash for work, limited donor dependent. We had NUSAF 3 limited access as well. And when you move to, if you have a disability, for example, if you're a vulnerable group in particular, there is no regular predictable support. And that again is our criteria on that. There are some grants, one-offs, but not predictable or regular. And for women are a group where they have certain requirements they want to see because they recognize also their vulnerability. Again, you may have certain one-offs but not predictable, and a key part of that is maternity care. So, and having good maternity care. So again, we come back to our public hospitals. How are they doing? How are they? I want to give you a lot of this, I know the Assistant Commissioners on the panel, so she'll speak a lot more about government's efforts. But I will tell you that for our key finding was we are still yet to truly implement a life cycle approach to social protection. The policy hopes that we can, but in reality, like I said, if you follow the age and everything, you will not find that there is as much. For older persons, of course, we have SAGE, and we'll get a bit more into it because I think it's a flagship one. So the key of our finding, one, we are doing some of these things in the absence of a very strong legal framework. SAGE, for example, we have the passion. We started giving out SAGE, and then we did the policy. And that was great, and the policy is quite comprehensive. But it's always good to have an enabling law. And we can look at our neighbor, Kenya, which does have one. And this is important because we do have some laws that touch on different things. There's even some, constitutional protection around things like pension, but you're going here, then you're going here, then you're going here. If you have something where you begin to think as a country and say, okay, what are we saying our people should have towards social protection, all in one place, in a law that enables you to be able to even make the case when you go to Parliament and say, actually, we're supposed to be able to do this because technically it's here. That will go a long way, and also help Ministry of Gender, because sometimes Ministry of Gender is trying to make the case, but without the enabling legal framework, it is left to the discretion of the donors or government or what is possible. Let's go to the next. I want to get to a bit into SAGE because we have a lot of older persons here. Somehow it's a thing that everyone talks about, but also it's because we are now more than 10 years into SAGE. And so we're able to look at this more critically. Like Dr. Nyende said, the amount has not changed in over a decade. And when you look at the cost of living crisis and everything, it's about 16,500 shillings today. When I heard the person say that they spent 30,000 to take a boda to get the money, and then there was debate. And I was like, that's the experience. It means that we're having trouble with the balancing of this, right? And we could do more to really increase the financing for older persons. According to the minimum expenditure basket calculations, we need at minimum one older person, 100,000, because, and this is government's sort of data looking at what you need to survive. So in a household of 5, you'd be 500,000 shillings. And also because we know that very many people are still excluded. Only 1 in 3 older persons are actually receiving SAGE. And this is as of the 2022 target that is in our National Development Plan 3. So this is government's on what is feasible as of this time. And up to now, we are 2 years past the target. We're only getting 1 in 3 older persons receiving it. And we know that they face heightened vulnerability, like they were pointing out. 2 in 3 persons are really struggling, 2 in 3 older persons. I would like to move to the next slide as well. And sometimes it's not just money. Sometimes it's things that could be fixed, and we were having that discussion outside around, for example, challenges national ID. Honorable Wako talked about how when older persons were being registered, there were certain challenges already at that point. And then because of that requirement, even when the field staff, the local government staff, or Ministry of Gender, some of this is brought to their attention, they struggle to have, they struggle to have, to be able to waive the national ID requirement. At the World Bank meetings, and this came up a lot, because the Uganda's SAGE program, the UN Special Rapporteur on Poverty was talking about the non-uptake of rights, and it featured the fact that the insistence on national ID solely is hindering uptake of this program. And so one of the things we were discussing at that session, and the World Bank on our session was saying, there are certain instances where government should be able to innovate and try to get it to people. And here you see twins. One is getting, one is not getting. So it's again, we are calling upon government again to really address some of these non-financial barriers that we can sit through and think through. Next slide. I want to get to financing because everything comes to money. And we also have Miss Isabella in the room, our IMF rep, and she'll get into it. But I think that one of the things that that protocol talks about is the fact that, first of all, you're supposed to be able to have actuarial assessments to look into, like, what is the funding situation, like who can contribute, who can't, how much should we give, all of that. First of all, the planning. And then it also pushes you to progressively increase the minimum percentage you're giving every year. Right? And it tells you how. It says, okay, what are the measures in which you're going to get this money? What measures are you taking to curb fraud, corruption, illicit financial flows? Like, where are you looking everywhere in your arsenal for money? Because you need to finance social protection. Again, it is a right. And also, how are you coordinating development support? Because development support for most of us African countries is there, and it's a reality. And so what are some of our key findings? On coordination of development support, they are trying. A number of us sit on that social protection thematic working group. And there are also some donors there and civil society, and a lot of these issues do get discussed there. And I know there's also a donor working group on social protection. But when you look at the financing, and this figure, 0.9%, is featured in a lot of government reports. So we began going back to really track it, and we saw it was really 2019, 2020. But even when you go to other years, it has never exceeded, really. We haven't gotten to 1%. And our policy talks about the fact that we should be able to have at least 1% for basic building blocks of GDP. For 2 of the largest direct income support programs, we've only spent in prior years, for example, 0.14%. Again, we're looking at this over time to get a sense. And we're comparing what are our peers doing. Kenya, Rwanda, again, still falling below par. And if you look again with the countries as well, we are still we are not there yet, right? In the report gives a bit of some of the case studies in terms of how much other countries give. I think in South Africa, it's like the older person get, I think, 400,000. In Kenya, it's more than ours. So it will be interesting for you to go through and see, okay, what is feasible, but what is also feasible for someone to live in dignity. Right? And of course, we talked about, for example, the Child Disability Benefit Grant. And we actually found, and government's own research has been looking into this as well, that it's actually feasible to do so, that you can finance it, just getting 0.048% of your GDP. And I'm going to talk a bit about how we can get some of this money, and I hope the panelists will get us thinking further. Can we truly afford not to finance? You know, when you think about financing, you can think about the money, the cost of what you're going to do, the money you're expending. what is the other cost of not doing so? And I want us to begin to think about that very critically. And with, I'm glad to see Madame Beatrice coming, because I know she was working a lot on the strategy. And they get into some of the costs in terms of when you don't interact, in terms of the ways in which social protection is actually having a stabilizing effect, but also the benefits, because our own data has seen that just with SAGE, there was a 20% drop in poverty, right? And if you, just with the current 25,000, and if you went up a little bit, I think it would be 35%. But also, when we think about financing, where will the money come from in a time of fiscal consolidation? We've argued again that if you look at, for example, how much Uganda loses in illicit financial flows, you can actually finance social protection, right? If you think about the tax exemptions that are given in ways that are not very, sometimes even very transparent, but tax exemptions as a whole, we have to think about them and say, okay, do we really have to get tax exemptions? Because when you give an exemption somewhere, it's money you're foregoing that you could be using to help your people. And so those are two areas. Of course, things like corruption as well. Remember when I think, who was it? She made a very good comment, and she said that when we lose money, when we are corrupt, it's not us as government that suffer. When people are corrupt, it is you, the people. And I think we need to begin to understand and think about, and one of the things that the report is trying to do is to say, okay, from corruption, from illicit financial flows, how much are you losing that you could actually use to transform, for example, that older person's life, right? And so it's encouraging us to have a more nuanced discussion around finance, and that's the beauty of this protocol. Let's go ahead. And so what are our recommendations? Because I saw that my time was up. One, we want government to ratify and domesticate this AU protocol on the rights of citizens to social protection. We think it's very valuable. It provides a way for you to really think about this in a way that is more holistic. And again, like I said, it's by Africans. African member states sitting and thinking what is feasible. It was not imposed by anyone else. To, of course, increase the financing for social protection. We all know it is inadequate. Right from the people who are engaging on a day-to-day. And the SAGE grant, for example, is a very easy example, because you just have to look at how much they're getting and how much you spend a week. And implementing a human rights-based and life cycle approach to social protection. As long as we don't begin to really think about it as a right, there will be always other more important pressing priorities that should be financed before it. And we sometimes forget that it is so integral for people to get these things, because then they're able to live in dignity. And also because you're in a social contract, you and the state, you're paying taxes, or you're required to keep certain things. And the state, when you're having a hard time, should be able to take care of you. Certain things, like I had said, were non-financial, allowing other forms of ID, particularly for older persons whose fingerprint were not able to be captured, or who have errors that were not of their own, doing ring fencing. And I want to get into this as well. I forgot to talk a bit about it when talking about financing. The other threat we are seeing to financing right now is, of course, there are austerity measures and fiscal consolidation being proposed. And one of our arguments has always been, you must ring fence. Certain things are so important. You look for anywhere else to cut, but don't come for social protection, don't come for health, don't come for education. They're really important. They're also helping the vulnerable, and also very important for us to be able to truly have inclusive growth. And then the last recommendation is really around debt. Because I talked about where we could get the money through the, but now debt has become the other thing that is sucking a lot of money. As we take on a lot of debt, it means more of our budgets, and we're in the budget cycle right now, most of our budget goes to servicing creditors. So there's less money available for you when you come and you say, I want money for social protection, I want money for health, I want money for education, which are all pressing needs that cannot wait. The thing that we've spoken more broadly about social protection. I want to take a minute and link it to climate and the discussions around that, because we can see right now, if there are Ugandans who doubt that climate change is here knocking at our door, then I think you need to wake up. Thank you for the knocking. But I think that one of the things that is very important is, as we are thinking about how to mitigate climate change, don't forget about social protection. And I'm appealing to the government officials, because social protection is so important to mitigating climate change. First of all, climate change is worsening our vulnerabilities, but it is also, at the same time, if you're thinking about how to get some of that climate financing to communities, then channeling it through social protection is extremely important. So that's just a snapshot of the findings. I'm really looking forward to when you all read the report. In terms of the methodology, which is just maybe the last thing, because I did get a bit of that question, we were looking at, for this report in particular, which was more of a literature review, so we're looking at government's own data, at World Bank data, and some of the government data is published, some of the data is more internal, and also just really looking at the figures. And then with certain segments, the vulnerable groups in particular, we did have some interfaces. But we also do have a photo essay. So the photo essay that was outside, and I'm answering this now because I got questions on that. The photo essay was done earlier. It was last year where we went to different communities to hear from people. One of the things the protocol emphasizes is participation of those who are supposed to be beneficiaries of social protection. So hearing from them, what is it like? What is your experience? Because sitting in Kampala, I have no idea what your experience is going to get, for example, a SAGE grant. So that is where that photo essay came from. And those are a few pictures that you saw outside. There's a whole photo essay on the website, and we shall also be giving out copies today. And the idea is to really stimulate this discussion. And yes, I'm being told my time is up. But thank you. This report was done by the Initiative for Social and Economic Rights and written also by RAISE, which is a Danish NGO and from whom we're learning a lot in terms of what's happening in other countries as well.
Thank you very much, Alana. Let's just give her a round of applause. I think ISER has done a very good job trying to bring us to where we are right now. And I know my panelists were introduced earlier, but allow me to just give them a minute or two to just self-introduce. Please tell us your name, tell us why you are here today, and we would like to have from you right as we kickstart this discussion. We'll start with the panelist right next to me.
Hi, my name is Isabella Karpovic, and I represent the International Monetary Fund. Thank you very much for the invitation to participate.
We are glad to have you, Isabella.
Morning, I'm Lydia Navirio, Acting Assistant Commissioner, Equity and Rights, Department of Equity and Rights, Directorate of Social Protection, Minister of Gender, Labour and Social Development. Glad to be here.
Thank you very much, Assistant Commissioner.
Yes, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Nakazi Florence. I work as a research fellow at the Economic Policy Research Center. All we deal in are policy-related issues, so this topic is very pertinent. We look forward to your discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Isa, for the invitation. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nona Tamale. I lecture at the School of Law, Makerere University, and I do research on financing for development.
We are glad to have you all, our panelists, Nona, Florence, and we'll start just at where we ended, looking at government's interventions in terms of social protection. Madam Lydia, if I may start with you, could you give us a glimpse in terms of where we are at as government of Uganda? What are our achievements in terms of social protection in this country, and are we where we should be?
Okay, thank you. For the benefit of everyone here, government of Uganda started thinking about social protection way back, and we see traces of planning for social protection right from the Second Poverty Eradication Action Plan, the National Development Plan 1, National Development Plan 2, National Development Plan 3. We are actually still thinking of taking it to the National Development Plan 4. Social protection is defined in our National Social Protection Policy 2015 as public and private interventions to address risks and vulnerabilities which expose individuals to income insecurity and social deprivation, leading to undignified lives. So we are really looking at interventions that are done by government or public sector, but also private sector. So all the support that the older persons are talking about, we still count it as social protection. So what have we been able to achieve as government? I've already talked about the planning. Any government policy or intervention has to find its room within the planning framework. So whenever we discuss anything, the question is, do we have this in our planning frameworks? So the fact that we have it in the Uganda Vision 2040, the fact that we have it in the National Development Plan is also a critical achievement. Otherwise, if it is not anywhere within the plans, it means that you cannot even think about budgeting for it or even planning for it. So that is a key thing we were able to achieve. But also the fact that in 2010, Cabinet made a decision to implement the social assistance grants for empowerment as a pilot program. That Cabinet decision, again, we find it to be a key achievement, because without it, we wouldn't even have this discussion of I'm left out, she's not here. But the fact that Cabinet made that decision and allowed the Minister of Gender, Labour and Social Development to implement the pilot social assistance grants for empowerment program, for us, we believe, is it has enabled us to move to where we are. And from that Cabinet decision in 2011, government started implementing the social assistance grants for empowerment program. So the fact that the cash transfer was actually delivered in Uganda by the Minister of Gender, Labour and Social Development, again, we find that to be an achievement, because as we started, everybody believed, you can't talk about giving money in this country, you're going to create dependency, it is not sustainable. But government took the firm decision to allow the implementation, and we've had stories from the beneficiaries. We've also had evaluations that have been made. I think Alana has referred to one of them to indicate the findings that it wasn't a waste of time to invest in social assistance grants for empowerment. And as we started that journey, we started with 14 pilot districts that were supported with the development partner funds, and government provided the staff, because without the staff, the implementation again wouldn't have been possible. But the government provided the staff at the center, which is the national level, but also at the local government level, to be able to support the older persons register, enroll, and be able to receive payments for the social assistance grant for empowerment. Again, for those that have been around, but for the benefit of others, in Karamoja, we started at the age of 60 years, and for the other districts in the pilot, it was 65 years and above. We were able to successfully implement the pilot, and the government allowed us to proceed to have an increment of districts. And at that point, I remember the decision was to register the 100 oldest persons per sub-county. We did that for the next 2 years, from 2016 to 2018, after which government decided to have a national rollout of the senior citizens grant. And with this, we have been able to achieve national coverage of the program, though the age is 80 years, but the policy decision was we start with 80 years due to the available funds, and as resources become available, the age would be reduced. And at this point, we've been having discussions on lowering that age, but also allowing other aspects to be taken into consideration to determine who benefits. And one of the aspects that has been considered is disability, to be able to enroll for the program.
And Lydia, if I could just pick a little bit on what you're saying. From what I'm hearing is that we've made steps.
Yes.
and very much progress since we started out as a country. But we also noticed that there are challenges. Could you speak a little bit on some of those challenges and just spotlight just a few in a minute or two?
Okay. So the challenges, of course, right from the discussion we had Jaja here speak, one of the challenges is limited coverage, but also the financing, which has impacted on who benefits, because ideally, from the policy presentation, an older person is 60 years and above. So if resources permitted, all the older person 60 years and above would be able to benefit. But because of the limited resources, we started with 80 years. But the other challenge are the policy decision we took to use the NERA data, where we require every eligible person to present a national ID. So the national ID has had some challenges, especially the errors on the data, with older persons who should be eligible being indicated as young. So they would ideally, if you looked at the data itself, they wouldn't qualify. But if you actually did a field visit, you'd actually realize that they qualify to be enrolled. We've also had challenges of limited appreciation and understanding of social protection and the role it plays in national development. Some people believe it's a waste of time, and yet it is a critical intervention by government. It shows government's social contract with the citizens, but also that there are benefits to the economy from the resources that are given to the beneficiaries of social protection interventions.
And thank you very much, Lydia, for truly pointing out the fact that as a country, we gain a lot when we are able to implement effectively our social protection measures. The report does state that just by introducing SEARCH, we had poverty reduced by 20%. And I'd like to talk a little bit more on some of the fiscal considerations that we need to take into regard when we are putting out such programs as this. And that brings me to you, Isabella. From an IMF perspective, we have had that they are truly economic challenges with the government of Uganda trying to ensure that we have social protection for all persons. How can we, looking at these challenges and the intersection of fiscal considerations, could you perhaps just spotlight how we can create a bit of a balance, truly, and if it's even truly possible, given our economic situation as a country?
Thank you for the question. First of all, the report is excellent. Congratulations on the report. Alana just stepped out, so she's not here to hear my praise, but I'm always very positively surprised by how thorough her presentations are, and I feel like there's not much I can add to it. But let me tell you a little bit of what I see as challenges, including the fiscal ones that you are mentioning. First of all, longevity has increased in this country. Let's not forget that. There are many more octogenarians today than even 20 years ago. Poverty has also increased, and we don't know by how much, but we know this has happened due to the COVID-19 shock across the continent, across the world actually. And the forthcoming UBOS census and household survey may be able to shed some light on how far we went into the wrong direction following a very successful decade of poverty, sustained poverty reduction. So if anything, more resources are needed today than in the past. And those resources are not there. Because in addition to the increased poverty and the longevity, all the governments have added 10% of GDP on top of their existing debt. And this is the situation in Uganda too. We are in a very favorable situation actually, because Uganda's debt is still sustainable. But in many other countries it is not, and they are undergoing very painful restructuring of the debt. So the Ugandan government is doing everything that is possible to avoid this situation. And that reduces the resources for development, for infrastructure, for social spending, for social protection spending across the board. What we have been trying to do under the program that is financed by the IMF is to preserve spending on social sectors and on social protection. We have 2 spending floors within the program, one of which is on social protection. So the hope was to increase over time the resources for social protection. But because of multiple shocks that the country underwent, even after COVID with the inflation shock, we were barely able to maintain the budgets as they were and increase a little bit. So definitely one of the main challenges is the lack of funds, and this lack of funds is also seen in the declining funding of the old programs that we knew of. So we talk about Uganda Women Entrepreneurship Program, the Youth Livelihood Program, but also other programs such as Operation Wealth Creation, the new SAP. We have seen the budgets of those programs decreasing over time. There are, however, new programs. There is a parish development model, and in my view, we have to work with it. We have to work with what we have. Louder, I'll try. The social protection program, one thing you will see in the report is that the social protection programs are fragmented. There are very many. It is difficult to put a number on them. I said, we see the values decreasing, however you take it, whether in nominal terms, in real terms, in percent of, in per capita terms. But the fact that they are fragmented and difficult to put a number on is just one side of the story. The other side, I believe that Alana mentioned, is that some of them are funded by developing partners, and that funding is not going to stay forever, which brings me to the sustainability of those programs, right? So we have to continue to make an effort to keep the resources available by advocating, but also doing research, and this is where ISER's contribution is very important, to highlight where the gaps are. Which part of the population is not covered? How can we reach that population? The fact that the money is there and that we strive to increase the capitation does not necessarily mean that we're reaching the people that need the grants. And the examples we have heard today from some of the beneficiaries of the social senior citizen grant give us, and the exhibition outside, give us a flavor of what is going on. In order to, other parts of spending are crucial in allowing access to those grants. If there is no infrastructure to reach a center where the person needs to get the national identification number and obtain the senior citizen grant, then he or she will not obtain it. If women do not own productive assets and do not have the right for land, they will not going to be able to access the funds under the Operation Wealth Creation or the parish development models. So investing in all of these areas, eliminating access constraints to those funds is as important as increasing funding for social protection. We have to enable people to access those funds. So I've talked a lot. We can maybe give a chance to others to speak.
I hope, wonderful. Thank you very much, Isabella. You spotlight an issue around debt. And hearing from community stories, the question around Uganda's debt is not only a national question, but it's very much individual. And when we are unable to spend on health, for example, to have social protection measures put in place for older persons, then we notice that the burden, the personal burden on debt, actually then shifts to people. And we've seen that move into private debt, just and beyond public debt. But I'd like to get a little bit more into the debt discussion. And Lydia, if it's okay, you could pass the mic on to Madam Nona Tamale. When we are talking about Uganda's debt levels, and Isabella says we are at a point where we are sustainable, right? I'd like to pick your mind on this, Nona. How do Uganda's debt levels impact on our ability to fund social protection? And can we for sure say we are at a level where we shouldn't be worried about it? Or are there specific interventions that we can be able to put in place now?
All right, thank you so much, Elizabeth, and the previous panelists that have laid the foundation for this discussion. So I was very interested, yes, when Isabel was speaking about the debt, because I hold a slightly different view. So why? When we think about social protection, I am glad Alana raised this. It's beyond just thinking about the social assistance program. It's more wholesome. That includes our spending on public education and our spending on public health. And as has been rightly pointed out, our debt has grown, our debt burden has grown. I think the Auditor General's report of last year says we are at a 52% debt to GDP ratio. And usually I see people, especially on Twitter, saying, but our debt isn't a problem, you know? There's countries that have debt to GDP ratios that are much higher than that. And what always comes to mind is it's not necessarily just how much debt we hold, but how is that debt burden affecting our expenditure on our SDGs? And I think if I use the broader language of SDGs, or we could say human rights, we could say public services, it's broad. And thinking about it in that lens, we see that our debt burden does inhibit our expenditure on SDGs, but also specifically for purposes of this discussion, social protection. If I could just share some more detail. The Ministry of Finance's debt sustainability analysis report from last year actually shows that we're spending around 32% of our revenues on servicing of debt. Right? So as we have a discussion about where the resources are coming from, we are taking out about almost a third of our money on debt. Specifically, when you look at expenditure on health and education, for instance, we spent around 4 times more on debt than we did on health between 2019 and 2021. And this is according to UN trade and development data, right? When we think about domestic debt specifically, we spent about 2.5% more on domestic debt interest payments than our education. So when I'm thinking broadly about social protection, before we even get into specifically the disbursed programs that we have, we are already, it's affecting how we spend on key sectors that protect us during shocks, right? And what does that have to do when we think about it in the broader sustainability argument? And I'm glad Isabel is here. I know the IMF is currently doing a review of their debt sustainability framework for low-income countries. And one of the criticisms that has been made, including by the UN, is the way debt sustainability is being measured. And a key factor has come out is, we are thinking a lot about ability to repay creditors. But we have to also think about it as a country at a national level. How are we actually spending? It should count for debt sustainability how much we are spending on our social sectors, on protecting people from shocks, right? And as we discussed, that cuts across the health, the education, and social protection. So lastly, just to conclude, I think thinking about sustainability more from repaying of our debt to creditors to more broadly how we're investing in SDGs and now climate discussion, because we have to also be able to adequately prepare people for climate shocks.
And you now introduce another topic on its own around climate change and financing and how that then interlinks with social protection. But you do say something around our debt to GDP ratio and how we are measuring debt as a country. And the good thing we have the IMF with us today. And so, and before I come to Florence on the question of climate, I'd like you, Isabel, to just respond briefly.
Yeah, thank you very much. I want to qualify my response, because my statement, because I completely agree with what you're saying. What we mean when we say that is not sustainable, we mean the country cannot service its debt anymore. It means you are in distress. No one wants to lend to that country. The banks say no. You have to go back and think about how to restructure it. But there is a broader idea, and this is the cost of that. And the cost of that is extremely high. It is high for the entire continent, and it's partly reflection on what is happening in the advanced economies. But it is very high for Uganda specifically. And the debt service competes with all these other priorities you're having, such as infrastructure, social spending, social protection spending. So over the longer term, if the borrowing costs cannot be lowered through global lowering of interest rates, reforms that the government needs to implement in order to at least maintain the situation as it is, then we would be at the risk of going into a non-sustainable position. I also must say that when we think about our 20-year baseline and looking into the debt sustainability, we don't project any shocks. I cannot say 5 years from now there is going to be an earthquake and that will lower the GDP growth, But one has to be ready for those shocks as well and build buffers. And therefore, if anything, has to think about how to lower the financing needs, how to mobilize revenues in order to rely on borrowing for development in the future. Thank you. I hope this answer satisfies you, Dalia.
I like that we are really getting into the meat of it. And you raise something around shocks, right? And we've seen more and more that we've had climate change come into play. Increasingly, we've seen the effects of it. But Florence, if I can just pick your mind around climate change, and particularly looking at the effects of climate change on social protection, how do you propose that the social protection measures that we are trying to put in place, and if there are any, can mitigate the effects of climate change? And as a country, where are we at on this climate change spectrum?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you very much for the previous speakers. To bring in the topic on climate change, as mentioned by the presenter, Alana, of course, gone are the days when we used to think vulnerability is only in terms of poverty. But now we see the climate change issues very, very close to us, and we are working with them. Because I can take an example of last year, when the rains came in too much. That means for whoever had beans, no wonder at the beginning of the year, we only had maize and never had beans. Right now, when everybody is expecting to plant, because one of our grandmas said how she's surviving is basically to till land. But when these come and they sweep everything, so what happens next? Before we dig deep into that, Elizabeth requested me to highlight how far, what is Uganda doing as far as climate change is concerned. All I can say that Uganda as a nation is not sleeping. We have a national climate change policy of 2015. So here we lay out a number of plans on how we are going to mitigate and adapt to climate change. But what is very critical here, that even in our plan, 70% of it is basically relying on external funding. So even in climate change, apart from social protection things, there is out of reliance on what? On donor funding. We are looking that even when we go ahead as a country, when we look at the planning for 2023-2024, under the National Crops, Environment, Climate Change, and that program, they allocated only 547 billions for that year. And yet in the plan we said, in our climate change plan, that we as a country, we are supposed to be spending over 255 million per year. So you just look at this, that even the money that we are planning for a whole program is just too minimal for anything to take off. So what are we going to do? Right now, when it's like the life cycle hypothesis, everybody is exposed to climate change. Just imagine if a mother is stealing and all they're depending on are the beans and the rest, those are gone. That means somebody gets affected right away when you're a baby. So what we are talking about, climate change, is not only for the adults, the elder we are seeing, but it's for every one of us. So in summary, all we can do, because he said, what are some, the question went, how should we think social protection can effectively mitigate the effects of climate change? So one way we've seen social protection being effective is basically the times when they are compensating whoever is affected. We've seen the Bududa landslides, the Kasese floods that swept everything, including the hospitals that government had set up. So that means at that time, of course, we see social protection in all the circles, I hear education. That time when there is a catastrophe, we cannot even wait. You just want to get an immediate. So that is one way we're seeing social protection in a way, mitigating people who have been affected by climate change. So the other way we can look at is where we come up with packages. Of course, as mentioned by one of the speakers, we have fragmented approaches. When you read through the whole cycle of social protection, everybody is coming in with their small packages. So how do we put things together? And we say, okay, if we are going to give out this money, are we adding any component that somebody should be able, because we saw the Nutri-Cash giving only mothers, the girls empowering girls here in Kampala. So everybody is coming in with their small package. Can we look at an area where we have a package, that there is this package, okay, we are giving you money, but maybe this money, I may take an example of maybe the NUSAF labor-intensive works. Unfortunately, all these ended in 2021, partly because we didn't have funds. But that could be an idea where I say, okay, for everybody who is able, whatever, can come and work. When you work on either this road, the money that we're giving, don't just go ahead and eat. Save some, maybe put something in business. Say that as a way, you're earning this money to build your resilience, not only that time when you get it, eat and finish like an elder one, but you can do a comprehensive way.
Thank you, Florence. You raise a critical question around sustainability.
Yes.
And where the current interventions that we have are indeed sustainable, hence the need for people to save, hence the need for people to plan. But it brings me to the question of what about the role of government in this particular instance? And if you could just help me pass that mic to Madam Lydia. I would like to ask you, Madam Lydia, is the challenge around the sporadic social protection interventions everywhere and not really having something more uniform, more concrete based on the legislative gaps? And if so, then how can we strengthen our legal framework? The report does spotlight the need to have the ratification of the AU Protocol on Social Protection. Is this something that we can do? And just give us your take on that.
Thank you. I wouldn't say the programs are donor supported because of lack of a policy, of a law. Not necessarily, because already within the National Social Protection Policy, we developed that policy using a life cycle approach. So the government position was to acknowledge the fact that every person, right from when they are still in their mother's womb, needs to have some kind of social protection. It doesn't necessarily have to be the cash transfer, but it can be the social care and support for those working, social security, so that they are able to save for the future or for retirement, or when they get an injury or when they have a disability. And we have been having discussions with our development partners to see to it that they support the government position and the policy priorities. So right now we have had some discussions on ensuring that we have comprehensive social protection services delivered across the life cycle. So still the development partners that you've shared that are implementing child-sensitive social protection, the girls empowering girls, are all coming together to see that we can put money in one basket to be able to support social protection across the life cycle. But speaking about the legislation, already we have some legislations in place. For instance, when we are discussing all aspects to do with children, we have that law. When we're discussing disability, we have the Persons with Disabilities Act 2020. For Social Security, we have the NSSF Act 22 CAPA 222, but also the amendment in 2021 that allows for midterm access, but also voluntary contributions. We believe, of course, that if we had a comprehensive law regarding social protection, it would make it have a stronger case for both in terms of ensuring one-stop center for all the social protection interventions, but also strengthening that legislative framework.
Thank you very much, Lydia. Yes, you make a very good case for us to have a strengthened legal framework. And I wonder, do we have any other measures that we can be able to put in place to ensure more inclusive social protection for everyone? And that brings me to you, Nona. You talked about the budget and the debt burden on Uganda. And I'm wondering, are there any economic strategies that as a country we can pursue to be able to balance some of these debt obligations and ensure that we are actually delivering social protection for everyone?
All right, thank you again, Liz. I think Alana mentioned in her presentation, and I think also this features partly in the report, under financing, as well as the AU protocol on social protection, just thinking about the financing strategies around social protection. One thing that cuts across, that has come strongly is, of course, taxation, because that's one of the main sources of domestic revenues that we can use to be able to invest in social protection. And I know taxation is a really heated issue right now in the country and of the informal sector, but I want us to discuss more around corporate tax, the tax of specifically looking at tax exemptions that Alana mentioned. So for years, there's been debate about whether we really need some of these tax exemptions, and the argument has been that the companies that are receiving these tax exemptions are helping to create jobs for Ugandans. And I was really glad to see the Auditor General's report of last year that assessed tax exemptions. I was surprised by the information. I did not know that it comes down to only about 36 companies receiving around 1.4 trillion in tax exemptions. And because of the argument of being able to gauge whether we're getting benefit from it, I was actually intrigued by the fact that most of them are actually not meeting the employment threshold that's required, the 50% of Ugandans being employed. I think in the report he mentioned that of 36 companies, 22 are not meeting that threshold, right? And Alana mentioned that we do lose revenues, so there's the question of lost revenues that we could be using to fund social protection. But the other angle is we actually also pay, because the Ministry of Finance actually pays on behalf of some of these companies that receive tax exemptions. And for just the financial year 2020 to 2023, the report indicates that they paid around 500 billion to those companies, right? And so now the question goes back to, and this is something even the Parliament has raised, right? Doing a continuous cost-benefit analysis of tax exemptions in the country, because I believe that's a really big pool of resources that could be used to actually be improving social spending. We're not saying there's completely no value from tax exemptions. They could be, but we need to be able as citizens to see the value of exemptions of this nature when we are not just losing in terms of potential revenues, but are actually losing revenues to some of these, through some of these exemptions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nona. It seems as a country we are paying companies not to pay our taxes. And it's disheartening from what you are saying. And you make a very good case around what we can do as a country. And we hope that the policymakers within the room are taking note of some of these recommendations. And allow me to get to you, Isabella. I've just been informed that we are at the point where we should be launching. And just very quickly pick your mind. Uganda is not an island. Other countries like